Big news out of a Texas court this week. A district judge has blocked a Texas bill that would have required schools to display the Ten Commandments in every public school classroom. You might be thinking, yeah, that's never been allowed. And for the past 50 years or so, yeah, that hasn't. But after some recent Supreme Court decisions, Texas may actually have a shot at the Supreme Court, which is exactly where I think this case is headed. So, quick overview. Earlier this year, Texas legislator passed Senate Bill 10, which would require every public school classroom to display a poster or a framed print of the Ten Commandments, at least 16 by 20 inches. Judge Fred Byery, a Clinton appointee from 1993, blocked it just before it was set to take effect on September 1st. Like I mentioned before, I actually think Texas has a real argument here. And I promise I'll get to their main argument later, but to really see where they're coming from, what their argument will be, and what the Supreme Court will be looking for, you have to understand the legal precedents at play here. So this case centers on the Establishment Clause, the part of the Constitution that says Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. And this is my real house. I went to law school and I loaded up on constitutional classes because I love this stuff. And honestly, this is why I went to law school, to be able to follow stories like this and actually have an opinion on them. Now, what I learned from those classes is that constitutional law went through massive changes around the 1950s, not just with civil rights, but across the board. The Supreme Court, especially since FDR's time, basically changed how it analyzes the Constitution. Everything from executive powers to civil rights and to these religion cases. So the big shift for the religion clauses started in 1947. Way back at the founding, and for maybe the first century or so of this country, states often had their own official religions. That was totally allowed under the Constitution. That changed with the 1947 case, Everson v. Board of Education. Everson was the first time the Supreme Court said that the Establishment Clause applies to the states. Before that, it, like the rest of the Bill of Rights, only applied to the federal government. But by the 1900s, the court started incorporating almost all of these rights to cover their states too, doing that through the 14th Amendment. And fun fact now, pretty much every part of the Bill of Rights has been incorporated to apply to the states, except for the Third Amendment quartering troops, because that just never comes up. But back to Everson. In that case, a New Jersey taxpayer challenged a state program that let public buses transport kids to private, mostly Catholic, schools. The Supreme Court ruled for New Jersey in this case, finding that it was okay because the service was available to everyone, not just religious schools. But importantly, the court said that the Establishment Clause does apply to the states now. But that case laid the framework for everything that has followed. The court upheld New Jersey's law mainly because busing kids had a general public purpose and any religious impact was indirect. So remember those two things. The law had a public purpose and an indirect effect on religion. So let's jump ahead now to 1970, the case Walls v. Tax Commission. A property owner in New York challenged tax exemptions for religious organizations. And I see a lot of liberals today upset about religious entities being tax exempt. But as we're covering here, the Supreme Court long ago ruled on this, and their rationale, quite frankly, makes a lot of sense. So the Supreme Court ruled 7-1 against the property owner. And churches aren't alone in being tax exempt. Tons of nonprofits also get those tax breaks. Why? Because they provide a public good. The court said that churches and nonprofits contribute to the well-being of the community in a variety of non-religious ways. They provide food, shelter, charity, a sense of community. Basically, they take on work that would otherwise fall to the government and taxpayers, and so they get a tax break because of it. Here's the kicker, though. The court said that taxing churches would make government more entangled with religion, not less. Think about it. Tax liens, property valuations, audits, all sorts of confrontations between government and religion. And that's one reason why religious tax exemptions stay, to avoid excessive government entanglement with religion. And those cases set the stage for the Lemon Test, which came out of Lemon v. Kurtzman in 1971. So what was Lemon v. Kurtzman actually about? Two states, Rhode Island and Pennsylvania, had passed similar laws. One law allowed public money to pay or supplement salaries for teachers of secular subjects at private schools. The other reimbursed those schools for buying secular textbooks and supplies. So the big question was, can the government support educational expenses in religious schools if the taxpayer money only goes to secular subjects? The court came up with a three-pronged test, now known as the Lemon Test. We'll go through it together using Lemon v. Kurtzman as the example. So the first prong, the law must have a secular purpose. Both Rhode Island and Pennsylvania said that their laws were all about improving education and making things easier on parents and schools. That counted as a secular purpose, so check, that's a win for these laws. The second prong, primary effect. Does the law's primary effect advance or inhibit religion? Here, both laws passed again. They only reimbursed teachers for teaching secular subjects, not religious ones. So the main impact was not to boost or inhibit religion. The third prong, excessive entanglement. And this is where it all falls apart. Does the government become excessively entangled in religion? The court in this case said that to be sure that the state's money isn't sneaking its way into religious instruction, the government would have to monitor the schools constantly. Checking lessons plans, watching over classrooms, making sure funds weren't being used for anything religious. And that's just way too much government mixed up in church affairs. So both laws flunked this last part, and that's why they got tossed. So just to recap, pass all 3 prongs of the Lemon Test and you're good. If you fail any one of them, the law is dead. Now, under the Lemon Test, laws like Texas's have been shot down before. Take Stone v. Graham in 1978. Kentucky required the Ten Commandments in every classroom, and the Ten Commandments were to be bought privately, not with taxpayer money. Kentucky tried to dodge the Lemon Test by putting a disclaimer on the Ten Commandments, claiming that the Ten Commandments were foundational to Western law and the common law of the United States. And that's a legitimate historical argument, but the Supreme Court still said no. They ruled that the main purpose of having the Ten Commandments on the wall is inherently religious, not secular or educational. The Ten Commandments weren't part of the curriculum, they were just posted up on the wall, which the court said would only make kids read and possibly venerate them. And if you just stopped there, you'd say that Texas law is doomed. But there's more to the story here. So Lynch v. Donnelly, 1984. We're going to break this down using the Lemon Test just as the court did in that case. This time, it was the city of Pawtucket, Rhode Island. They put up a Christmas display that included a nativity scene in a public park. And it wasn't just a nativity scene. It was Santa Claus, reindeer, candy canes, all the holiday stuff. But the nativity was the big lightning rod, and the ACLU sued, saying that the city violated the Establishment Clause by putting up a nativity scene. So, Lemon Test. First prong, a secular purpose. The city argued that the whole display, including the nativity, was there to celebrate the historical origins of Christmas as a national holiday, not to promote religion. And the court bought that argument. They said that acknowledging Christmas's religious roots can serve a legitimate secular purpose. In other words, governments can acknowledge religion. Second prong, primary effect. Did this display mainly advance religion? The court said no, it doesn't. The effect was not to promote Christianity because it was one part of a broader holiday setting, packed with secular symbols like Santa and candy canes. If anything, the religious message was diluted by all the other decorations. Third prong, excessive entanglement. Here, the city did not spend any money maintaining the nativity scene, and its involvement was minimal. So there was no excessive entanglement. The government was not meddling in religious affairs, they were just putting up decorations. So under the Lemon Test, the display passed all 3 prongs, and the court upheld it. That's a big contrast to Stone v. Graham, and it shows that Lemon Test wasn't always a death sentence for anything religious. Context mattered. Sometimes even religious displays could survive as long as they checked the 3 boxes of the Lemon Test. But all of this has changed recently because the Supreme Court has moved away from the Lemon Test. The move away started with Van Orden v. Perry in 2005. That case involved a 6-foot Ten Commandments monument on the Texas State Capitol grounds, one of many monuments on the grounds. The Supreme Court upheld it, not using Lemon at all. Instead, they took a historical practices approach. Basically, the court highlighted America's long tradition of publicly acknowledging religion. The Ten Commandments, they said, are as much a part of the history of law in the West as they are a religious document. The monument was passive, just one of many, and stood for decades without any controversy. Side note on this case, the deciding vote was Justice Breyer, a liberal. He wrote that the Ten Commandments can be both secular, a moral message, a piece of history, and religious, depending on the context. So finally, we get to the end of Lemon with Kennedy v. Bremerton School District. That was the Washington case of the football coach who was fired for praying on the field. Justice Gorsuch, in his opinion, outright said that the court long ago abandoned the Lemon Test. Now, the Establishment Clause approach is all about historical practices and understandings. The court looks at what's actually been done historically, not just some tests that the court made up. So what does that mean for Texas today? We're about to find out as this case and others from Louisiana and Oklahoma move up the judicial food chain. But here's what I can say for sure. Texas has a legitimate argument to make. Using Van Orden as a template and Kennedy as confirmation that the court now uses a historical test, here is Texas's argument. First, Texas is going to take the historical argument. And for them, it's a straightforward one. The Ten Commandments fit within over 2 centuries of government acknowledgement of religion in American public life. As the court recognized back in Lynch v. Donnelly, acknowledging religion is not the same as establishing religion. Our institutions are filled with examples. Moses and the tablets are carved into the Supreme Court itself. Congress still opens its sessions with prayer, and states even had official religions at the nation's founding. Texas isn't asking the court to bless a denomination or endorse worship. Their argument is that if acknowledgments this explicit and far-reaching have long been a part of American tradition, then a classroom display of the Ten Commandments fit comfortably within that constitutional history. Second, Texas will argue that posting the Ten Commandments has a legitimate secular purpose. They'll say it's a way of recognizing the foundational sources of law and morality in Western civilization. And honestly, this idea really resonates with me on a personal level. So the fraternity I joined in college recently rebranded as Men of Tradition. And I was recently invited back this summer to help train the new officers as the group's chaplain at the officer training site. After I ran the chapel session, I challenged the new officers to think about why a chaplain role even exists and why we have chapel service at our retreats. Some said, it was for reflection or just tradition, but that doesn't capture the deeper meaning for me. In law school and throughout my life, I've come to believe that Western civilization stands on 3 intertwined pillars: Rome, Athens, Jerusalem. Rome gave us our legal system. Athens gave us reason and debate. And Jerusalem gave us our moral code, the ideas of right and wrong, and the moral courage to act on those convictions. The Ten Commandments are at the heart of that Jerusalem pillar. You take away any one of those three pillars, and the structure that is Western civilization collapses. And here's the key for Texas. Schools already teach from the Roman and Athenian foundations. We study the Constitution, legal traditions, and structure of government. We teach philosophy, civic reasoning, debate. But what's missing from the public classroom is that third pillar, the moral framework. By displaying the Ten Commandments, Texas will argue that the state is completing the picture, not to impose a religion, but to acknowledge the civic and cultural foundations that helped shape the very society that our students live in. That, Texas will say, is a valid secular purpose, no different in quality than teaching the Magna Carta or the Declaration of Independence. So with Lemon gone and the Supreme Court embracing tradition and history, Texas's argument is not just a legal strategy, it's a genuine stress test for where we draw the line between acknowledgement and endorsement. Their case combines two ideas. The Ten Commandments are more than a religious text. They're woven into the fabric of Western law, morality, and the American classroom, and historical precedent. Courtroom debate and even personal experiences remind us that the boundaries between faith, law, and public life aren't static. They shift with every new ruling, every new societal challenge. And as someone who spent years studying these issues, first in law school, now in civic life, I see the stakes here are bigger than Texas. The Supreme Court will be asked not only to interpret a state statute, but to clarify whether our national tradition allows schools to acknowledge the moral underpinnings of our society, or whether the mere presence of Ten Commandments is a step too far. We've come a long way from Stone v. Graham, and the question now isn't what the rules were, but what they mean today, from a historical perspective. So as this case makes its way up the judicial ladder, it's about much more than a poster in a classroom. It's about the constitutional soul of America. Whether Texas wins or loses, the debate won't stop there. And personally, I think it's a debate worth having. If you stuck around to the end, enjoyed the discussion, I want to hear your thoughts in the comments. Hit like, subscribe, keep me motivated to keep making these videos. I enjoy doing it. I enjoy thinking about these sort of things, so I figured I'd just start making videos about them. So I want to hear your thoughts, and hit like, subscribe. Thank you.